Good morning, or perhaps not for some, but anyway, after the dinner. This is the worst time to do a keynote, I have to tell you, after the dinner, as one can see. I would like to thank Sue and Chris for inviting me. This is the second time I've been down to New Zealand to do some work here at the centre. I'd also, as is customary in Australia, to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay respect to their elders past and present. This particular project actually comes out of the project that Sue was talking about, so it's going to be much more focused in a way on a particular aspect of the project, that of leaderism and gender. So let me start. First of all, location. Now, most of you think that you're at the centre of the world when you're in Europe. Well, I have to tell you, those of us who come from the southern lands, this is how we see the world. You can see that we are geographically isolated. New Zealand likes this map because they're on top of Australia, but we know better. We also, you can see that geographic isolation means that we are often seen to be the place where new ideas, new possibilities are nurtured, and often where we also adopt policies from elsewhere and often pick the worst aspects of those policies rather than the best. But we also do things mean and lean because we are so isolated. We don't belong to the EU, and we don't belong to the North American types of international trade agreements, and we don't belong to the Asian sector very much either. So it's an interesting positionality for us in Australia and New Zealand. Pardon? I know we trade with them, but it's... Okay, right, okay. So, secondly, I want to position myself. The positioning of ourselves is very much around the fact that I've been at the same university, Deakin University, since 1987. I had the pleasure of sharing a room next to Fazil Rizvi. So whenever I hear the word Fascal, you know that I am... this is to control him immediately, to stop him to say anything from now on. All right, so in this time at Deakin, I have been restructured numerous times. I've been rebadged, and we have gone through multiple restructurings with other institutions, with other... we've been restructured, downsized in terms of sizes of faculties, and we've been amalgamated. The Faculty of Arts and Education have been amalgamated. So I've seen 5 Vice-Chancellors, I've seen about 7 DVCs in charge of our area, I've seen about 6 Deans and about 8 heads of school during that time. So I survived all of that. Okay, but the 2 major phases of restructuring that have been going on really have been one that I would say is one that goes from post-1989 in Australia, very much around the Dawkins reforms, which were very much framed in a national frame of a liberal humanist education with a focus on a unified system of higher education, in which universities were seen to be comprehensive in the programs they offered. The focus was on massification, with a tension between the equity and efficiency arguments at that time. It was about research capacity building with a focus on quantity, that is, as measured by income going in, HDRs, completions and publications. But since post-2000, with the discourse of the knowledge economies, universities are now transnational corporations. They exist in globalised markets, highly competitive and more precarious for students, academics and the universities themselves. There's increased differentiation and specialisation within the national and international systems. The quality and excellence is now the driver of the sector scaling up, and instrumentalism is the use value is really dominant in terms of the discourse. Okay. The strategies that have achieved this shift have been very much around simultaneous processes, and one could argue ideologies, of managerialism, marketisation and privatisation. The state and the universities now mediate market relations at the local, national and international level. Governance by both states and universities is through steering from a distance, and we have the performativity cycle with the focus on output, not input, and in which policy and financial contracts are the steering mechanisms. And comparison now, indeed, is the new mode of global governance and institutional governance. Now, the project I'm going to talk of is the one that Sue was talking about. It's called Leadership in Entrepreneurial Universities, Diversity and Disengagement. And it is about the questioning of the lack of diversity in and of leadership and disengagement with leadership. It's an Australian Research Council funded project in which we had 3 Australian case study universities, a G of 8 which was established around in the 1850s, a UTech established as a university from an Institute of Technology post-1989, and a regional university that was established in the 1960s. We undertook a website and critical policy analysis, and our interviews would be about, at the end of this project, will be about 270. The whole idea was that we interviewed everybody, right through from the Vice-Chancellors to the postgrad students. We interviewed the research leaders, the people in charge of research centres, the teaching, people in charge of teaching and learning, line management leaders. We interviewed across all disciplines, misspelt I can see, and we interviewed the equal opportunity people, the union, the HR, or as Rebecca nicely puts it, not human relations, but human remains. I'm going to use that a lot, Nat. Thank you, Rebecca. And policymakers, University of Australia, the academies, the social sciences, the learned academies, and the various search firms that actually go out and look for academics, particularly at the senior level. And the similar projects have been undertaken in Denmark, Taiwan, Ireland, USA and Spain. Now, the aims of the project were really, in the way in which we conceptualised it in the Australian project, was how contemporary leaders are addressing challenges to higher education, what were their pathways into either managerial or research leadership, and where were the next generation of leaders coming from. The focus actually was not on gender, but we did ask about the personal aspects and how they lived their lives in relationship to work. And the leadership really was the lens through which we used as a way of analysing how organisational change was being brought about. And as I have a want to be, I undertook a feminist analysis of this, and my argument is that when you're undertaking a feminist analysis, you really have to think around the structural and institutional formations in order to understand how gender works through institutions and how it works in terms of everyday practice. You need to look at the material conditions under which people work, the divisions of labour, how time is used, how space is used. You need to look at the social practices, at the cultural, the semiotic and the symbolic. You need to understand how the epistemological works in terms of how we understand knowledge, power relations and what is valued. And all of this needs to be worked through the global and local articulations and in terms of how gender relations work through. Jeff Hearn argues that we need to investigate, when we're talking about gender, the social relations of gender, the micro-practices of universities, given the wide discourse that diversity is a good thing. And he argues that we need to look at the subtle nature of the gendered processes in organisations, the gendering of organisational change processes, the gendered form and impact of interventions to remedy inequality. So I'll be working through those ideas now through the rest of the presentation. I've argued in previous work from other studies I've done on restructuring and gender that gendered restructuring is where the assumption, the processes, the structures and practices of restructuring at the global, national, institutional level are gendered. That is, the functioning of universities, the social institutions, where gender is done in a specific way, requires the need to analyse how the structural, cultural and procedural arrangements of academic organising constitute gender relations. Gender is part of organising. And similarly, markets are institutions imbued with structural power relations, and that those also have an asymmetrical gender dimension to them. So how we are managed, how we're organised and how markets work are all have certain implications around gender. But to take that broader structural overarching global look, I want to start off and talk about education as a field. Now, education is not a discipline. It is a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary field of research. As such, it draws from other disciplines, and indeed we need to know more than one discipline. So in other words, I myself have a background in history, policy studies, sociology, comparative education. So educators actually pull across from the disciplinary basis, and indeed, in that sense, education is a very interesting field of research. And indeed, perhaps is the future of where research is going, rather than actually just staying within the disciplines. Anyway, so education is a field. We know that as broadly as a field, though, in terms of practice, research, and in terms of the way the world works, we know that within education, that governance now of educational bodies is about coordination and regulation now, rather than provision. We know that there's greater seamlessness between the sectors and national systems in order to facilitate lifelong learning, work pathways. We've got a national qualification framework in Australia, and there's the Bologna framework, for example. We know that educational institutions are far more porous now through partnerships, industry school partnerships, government partnerships. We know that there's increased private provision occurring. Certainly in Australia now, we've got private providers being allowed to compete and take on the same types of credentials and degree courses as universities. So that raises questions about the quality of those credentials and issues around what that means for the academy. We even have private providers working within the academy, such as SEEK, which is it's an employment firm, actually now offers within universities courses. So the private-public boundaries are being blurred. We have quality and excellence now as being, as we know, on the ranking mechanisms, I say no more. Content and courses of the content and focus of courses is increasingly being driven and determined by the demand of the stakeholders, whether it's students, professions and industry, and we know that you can be made redundant. A whole area can be made redundant if there's no demand for it by students. And we are all into multimodal teaching and learning. That is about personalised learning for students, it's about the new digital pedagogies, it's about innovative learning environments. For example, this is supposed to be an innovative learning environment that we're sitting in at the moment, and it's freezing. It's meant to be sustainable, but everywhere I go around universities at the moment, we have new buildings, unbelievable buildings. We have one at Deakin, I think the spaceship has landed virtually in Burwood, which is a very... and the mothership is there, and it's just unbelievable size. But every building I go to, you look at what's happening to the students. They have these fantastic spaces, flexibility. You look where the academics are, they're shunted off in the corner in little glass boxes, no air, no outdoor images. It's an interesting spatial dimension now that shows the role of academics as the marginal workers at the academy, at the university. Just a small point. Anyway, so 20th century... distraction there. 20th century education, though, has gone from being a state-centred project of nation building, though, to a 21st century as a transnational project. And as Stephen Boyle has pointed out with regard to schooling, but it's no longer really that separate from universities, I have to say, that universities as transnational corporations, we have multiple campuses, partnerships, offshore credentialing. We now credential MOOCs, for example, from other universities, credential other courses. We have multiple modes of governance operating within the academy, within universities, the old bureaucratic collegial models to get overlaid by corporate models, overlaid by now more networky type of models, all with different forms of accountability. We have greater contractualism in the sense of how we make contracts with our students, with each other, how we make contracts for PhD students, how the universities contract out a lot of their services, like ICT. All of this is a blurring of what constitutes the public and the private. We have a greater move towards self-responsibilisation in terms of the accountability and work being downloaded onto individual academics. And it all raises questions around professionalism. Is professionalism being transformed? Are academics going to be the new technicians for hire, rather than the advocates or critical intellectuals that we talked about and that Nick talked about in terms of the critical spaces in the ways in which we can work within the academy. And where are those spaces? Are they shrinking? So in a sense, I like this image because it actually portrays the fragility of the education, higher education sector. The very thin little strings there that if one gets cut, the whole edifice will collapse, the old books that are gone, the game of chance that it is for both individuals and for universities and those in it. And of course the old egghead. I thought that the egg was close enough to an egghead, but the sitting there, the notion there. So I'm now going to talk through how I see the processes of regendering of the global domestic transnational space of higher ed. And I'm arguing here that there's multiple contradictory and converging processes underway that we are reconstituting those gender relations. The first one is the differentiation and greater differentiation and specialisation occurring within the Australian university sector. Secondly, the intensification and diversification of academic work. The shift in labour and power from academics to managers. The regendering of power-knowledge relations and the greater centralisation of decision-making. And I'm arguing that all of this converges towards a focus on leaderism. Okay, let's start off with institutional differentiation and rebranding. In Australia, we have university compacts with government and it encourages a rebranding to be distinctive. Now, I refuse to be rebranded, so I don't use the official template here. I use the older version, which still has Deakin here. We are now Deakin Worldly. You may laugh now. I laughed hysterically, and I said that means I'm an academic slut. I do anything, anywhere, anytime, anywhere with anyone. The Vice-Chancellor was standing right behind me at the time, and she wasn't amused. Anyway, but I have been rebranded numerous times and refused to take on the new brand any time for quite some time. Secondly, research and reputation, we know, are now the key indicators of quality. And so you're seeing the rise of research centres and increased specialisation with a greater focus on science and technology. Now, nearly every university in Australia thinks science and technology is the way to solve their problems because that's where the money lies. We have 12 strategic research centres at Deakin. 10 of those 12 are focusing on either the health or medical sciences or the material sciences. There are 2, one's in the humanities and political sciences, and I head the one on education. Research concentration. ERA, which is our research assessment in Australia, is now all about strategic positioning, and it favours, in the main, because it is about the concentration of research, those research-intensive, older, established universities. The research assessment systems have changed the institutional and disciplinary practices, in particular that of humanities and the social sciences. We're all moving towards big teams. We've just been told that we have to focus on Thomson ISS citations to improve them and focus on particular types of journals, which is very problematic for a professional field such as education. We do both pure and applied research. We are meant to have impact in our professional field. Having impact does not mean publishing necessarily, having impact in citations. There is, and to use the wonderful notion of creative rebundling, there has been a creative rebundling of disciplines, thank you Nick, and in one university in our case study, humanities and social sciences and the arts have been collapsed into a new interdisciplinary faculty called creative industries, of which now design, but not just design, but fashion is one of the new disciplines. A discipline, it's called a discipline, fashion. So, we are seeing enterprise bargaining and greater salary differentials arising between and within universities are increasing, and we know that as soon as there are individual contracts that women don't do as well at negotiating. Right, at the same time that is happening broadly, there's an intensification and diversification and unbundling of academic work. We know that across the sector there's a casualisation and feminisation of academics cross-nationally as well as in Australia, and in Australia you have up to 80% of casual staff in the research areas. It's very much what has been called a casual and careless treatment of academics. There's overload due to the expanding scope, scale and depth of academic work, all the things I've listed, and a tightening up of surveillance with workload allocation models. There's a downloading of administrative and quality assurance work helped by the new technologies. There's a ratcheting up of expectations through point systems in research that you get in student evaluations and which you always have to told you have to improve. There's teaching. Teaching is being unbundled into various things. If you get into a lot of online work, as we have at Deakin, you'll find that you have a whole lot of people now doing instructional design. Some people do the content, other people do the tutoring, and other people do the assessment. So you have this unbundling of the pedagogical process. You have an increasing distinction, largely pushed by the fact that research assessment in Australia focuses on the whole faculty or the whole area or disciplinary area, like we're in Code 1300. And so therefore, if you're anyone who's in that area is counted, pretty much. You can't select out people. So therefore, you're seeing a dismantling of people into teaching only. If someone doesn't meet the grade, they are being encouraged to stay in teaching only. We're finding there's reducing numbers across the sector of teaching and research, which is how we all used to be, and then there's increasing numbers of research-only people. Quality assurance, we know, is encouraging greater conformity and consistency. We're into the life of templates. E-learning and partnerships see the emergence of new professionals undertaking academic work, so you have academic and professional roles merging. And there's a pressure to align individuals, always to align our teaching and research, always through performance reviews, to every level of strategic planning, right through from the faculty to the, well, they have to align with, for me in research, they have to align with what I say happens in our strategic research centre. So academics feel overwhelmed and undervalued. That's my tendency, is just put it up there and just organise myself and leave, right? Don't do it. Okay, so what are the gender effects? So basically the intensification of labour is impacting on the quality of life and well-being, leading to work-life, family imbalance and conflict. We talk about family-life balance, it's actually an imbalance. It's about actually a conflict between the two things. That women with doctorates are moving into research administration rather than staying on as academics, as it's a far more controllable environment. That women tend to be overqualified but still start lower down the salary scale, and that this leads to the fact that women's salaries are generally lower than men's. In the G of 8, research-intensive universities, from 2008 to 11, the proportion of men and women in the research roles was roughly equal. And what's interesting that you're seeing different things happening in different types of universities. So what's happening in research-intensive universities, what we call the G of 8, is quite different to what's happening elsewhere. But in the research-intensive universities, you're finding the number of men and women in research-only roles, well, the number of women in those has reduced and has gone up for men, and the number in the teaching-only roles has actually increased for women and gone down for men. So you're starting to see a gender, some types of patterns occurring there. And of course, most of the women are still located lower down, and most of the women are still sit at the senior lecturer level, and even though we're increasing gradually over the period of time, most of the women are sitting in, and it's very hard to get the figures of associate professors, most of them at associate professor level, not at professor level. I think we have a 22% at professor level. So in all of this, we know that performativity deadens passion. Your heartline is buried under your deadlines. And we know that the next generation of academics are leaving and seeing working their way up into leadership is way too hard. They look at people like me and said, I don't want to be like that. Understandably, I think. Okay, so moving on to the next point. Significant international studies are providing evidence of persistent patterns of horizontal segregation by discipline and vertical segregation by level of seniority of women in higher ed and research. And I'm going to now call on the work of Julie Rowlands over here, who will be speaking after me anyway, who does a lot of work on academic governance. And there's been a shift from academic involvement in decision-making to managerial decision-making. When we asked Vice-Chancellors and DVCs, Deputy Vice-Chancellors and Pro-Vice-Chancellors, one of the challenges to the university, a lot of them said we have to be adept, quick, and one, as in this case, nimble. And they make the point that, that of the major challenges that occurred in the 1990s, that they felt the Australian education sector did quite well. We were very nimble. We did a lot of work around commercial, international education, and we are a good brand. Okay? So, using the argument around the need to be a nimble university, being nimble, the Vice-Chancellors and Executive argued, demanded a rapid response to changing policies and circumstances. So as a consequence of that, we're seeing the move towards parallel managerial decision-making committees that effectively sideline traditional formal academic procedures, reducing academic input. We're seeing smaller executive committees closest to the VC, which now includes not just the DVCs, the Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Teaching and Learning and Research, but also heads of finance, international and administration. But in general, there's a fewer there with the academic voice in those executive committees. And we see the power in salaries, as well as the number of executives increasing, while academic salaries are dropping comparatively. And work has just been done by Tony on this, about academic salaries. So what we know is that in Australia that some Vice-Chancellors have got up to $1.5 million as a salary. Others are sitting around $800,000, $900,000. So it's about 4 or 5 times a professorial salary. In terms of academic governance, university councils are now increasingly, or can, if they wish, exclude academic or student representation under new statutes. The academic board chairs, which tend to be elected in many institutions, but not necessarily, it's very variable across the Australian sector. The academic board chair is being now incorporated into the executive committee in many cases, raising some sense of ambiguity as to what their role is in terms of representing academic voice or having to align with the corporate strategic plans and to what degree they have to adhere with that. There's an ex officio presence of DVCs and PVCs and deans on both academic boards and on all the various committees. Now, what this means, as Julie points out, that there's a continuity of leadership narrative. They decide what information is present. The decision-making is done outside the board, and largely what academic boards do now is quality assurance. And that is more of a transmission rather than consultative model of governance. And so, using Bourdieu, she argues that the shift in power from intellectual capital to academic capital has occurred, and it's bestowed to the position of the top organisational hierarchy. And it's a form of symbolic violence in the sense that academic role is just reduced to that of quality assurance, but the framework is very much of a corporate decision-making. And in talking to some of the professors around the role of academic board, one female professor who was former chair, and she's a DVC, was former chair of an academic board, said we don't have an active academic board anymore, and yet what they've done at this university is she held the position half-time, and then when it was her tenure finished, they instituted a full-time position and with administrative help. And so they literally now become part of the corporate process. The male head of School of Humanities at UMetro said, academic board was a feminised space. An interesting comment. What does he mean by a feminised space? Does he mean it's weaker? Does it mean there's more women in there? It's a very fascinating notion of academic board. Powerless, less power. When asking about the role of professoriate, one of the, and most of the, it was interesting, nearly all of the senior people we said, oh, and what's the role of the professoriate in all of this? And they said, oh, that's an interesting question. And then they went through and largely damned the professoriate, and I could have gone through pages of that in itself. It's a paper on its own. But as one VC said, what I do say to people who whinge is that I say to them, why don't you piss off for a semester and actually experience life somewhere else? Then you can, sorry to be blunt, and you have to see if he wasn't blunt before, but then you can come back and say this is a good place or not good place and have some perspective about it. But it is often those people who have never been anywhere else who think the world is wicked. Wicked. Is this because we do critical thinking, critical analysis, because we are oppositional? Interesting terms. I love the way the language here is positioning. So this is what an executive committee looks like. Men in suits with the occasional... Right. At the same time, there's another process of reinvigorated disciplinarity. We know that organisational restructuring trends have been that the social sciences, humanities and arts have been amalgamated usually into one large faculty. And then you've usually got a few other faculties, you know, health sciences, then you have the material sciences and so on. Technology management still sits on its own often sometimes. You have the institutional. What that does is it reduces both the size and also the voice of these disciplines, which tend to be the ones which have the highest level of female concentrations of staff and students. Institutional responses have been to create this sort of like strategic research centres, again largely led by men. Of the 12 research centres at Deakin, I'm the only female. And the individual sociologists, historians, anthropologists are embedded within these interdisciplinary centres, focusing on these health, material sciences and technology. So they now see the disciplines, the social science disciplines and humanities as servicing the other sciences. And when you say, well, they say, well, we're not growing our own, we just expect the G of 8 up the road to do that for us. So it's an interesting thought about what is happening to those disciplines. And of course we know that many of the areas of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, such as women's studies and indeed education, find it much more difficult to argue the case. So what are the gendered effects of this? Well, we know that what happens is that there's a science mindset now that is currently dominating all committee systems. We know that ERA is promoting one particular way of doing things, one best way of publishing, one best method of evaluation, one best method of research, and it does devalue certain feminist and critical approaches across all fields. So we know that research leadership is getting harder. We know that the baby boom women who achieve, like myself, who achieve academic leadership later as the expectations escalate. And I think the ARC shows that when women get to 65 plus, that's when they have their greatest achievements after 65. So I have hope still. Women undertake much of the research work as research fellows, HDRs and junior academics, while most of the men do the research leadership and management. And again, if you look at ARCs, that's again the pattern that's occurring there. So where are the next generation of women leaders coming from? Well, we know if you look at the areas where women are not, they're not in the areas where, in the science areas, which is where leadership is coming from. They are in the areas where there's less capacity of voice. And so what happens is that it does not translate easily into research leadership. And we know in particular that women in science have experienced a particular form of gender segregation. And it's becoming some concern. The Guardian in the UK and in the Australian. A study by Susan Fateras showed that she looked at the group of 8 universities, the research-intensive universities, and if you note here, the only one was the University of New South Wales, that after 2010, which is when the research assessment era started to come into play, that the number of women in continuing or contract positions at the academy is decreasing. So, I think it's very much around the point made here is that the issues around gender inequality in academia is made by the symbolic images of science and of abstract ideal academic. This image represents science as a voracious system, an ivory tower with very stringent rules for ascending within the tower that requires constant attention, that does not tolerate part-time work, the distraction that children provide, or any other distraction for that matter. The ideal scientist then is the dedicated intellectual who lives and breathes academia and is engaged in his, naturally, studies practically 24 hours a day. And in interviewing all the research leaders of all the various strategic research centres that we have, when you asked people about their family life and how they got to be where they got, in every instance, the mobility that was required to get to that position, the wife followed and the children tended to follow the men who are in charge of those strategic research centres. So the mobility, global mobility, is now becoming it's like a baseline around leadership in research. There's also been the push towards the centralisation of, I've just lost my point, the centralisation of executive power. There's an expanding ranks of the executive, greater executive prerogative is being mobilised, and again, it's still male-dominated. There are women moving up into the executive positions, and that's what I want to talk about now in the next part, what happens when they move into these positions. Institutional responses to the corporatisation of the university. One division head of administration, what's happened is that they've unpacked these administrative positions at the top. There used to be one person in charge of administration. Now they're all unpacked into these engagement, international corporate programs, international. They were all under one head previously. So these are now the proliferation of DVCs and PVCs. They are now recruiting more senior academics, deans and above, with industry links into these positions. And international education itself takes on a particular role as part of these branding and recruitment exercises. Increasingly, these executive committees see that they can manage research, and we've been talking about some of this already. They believe that they can control the strategic direction of research, the distinctiveness through research centres, that there's greater surveillance, as we know, of research applications. We have consultants constantly telling us, who aren't in our field, telling us what we should put into research grants. Huge amounts of money is spent and time and effort is spent on telling us how to write research grants, often not to improve them necessarily. There's increased intervention in research groups. For example, I have to go back and have a strategic research group, executive research group is now going to help me go through a process to strategically reposition the centre. And that's them and just me and two others in the centre, whereas the centre developed out of 30 academics sitting down and talking about who are we. So I can see I'll be not there that long, anyway. So we've seen requiring greater alignment of individual and collective research enterprise and the belief that executives can manage research productivity into the future. Can you see it or not? I was waiting for the laugh. I was wondering if you could see it. Okay, so in a way, this is what, having direction from above. This is what you might call is leaderism. And Louise Morley talks about leaders as a solution to rapid change. The cultural ideology of leaderism suggests that certain subjectivities, values, behaviours, dispositions and characteristics can strategically overcome institutional inertia, outflank resistance and recalcitrance, and provide direction for new university futures. And you find that at the executive leadership is the level where academic and management identities are negotiated and the values around the role of the university are being mobilised. We're finding that the pathways of getting into executive leadership are therefore radically changing. In the past, many would work their way up through from head of school through to dean, PVC, etc. That now is becoming more of a dead end, as one middle manager said, because they're not seen to be strategic enough or globally oriented. And it's actually where a lot of women are moving into head of school positions. Quite interesting, and PVC. The academic path used to be through academic board chair and then moving up through PVC. That's also now seen to be feminised or domestic labour. And the external appointments now are increasingly through industry because they are now seen to provide the expertise for partnership, commercialisation and engagement. So in a sense, the idea that you have 9 lives and that you move in and out of the academy is becoming increasingly, and you have this external type of focus. We know that of the current VCs in Australia, that most of them had some type of leadership position outside of higher education, and whilst they didn't see it as an absolute necessity to be in one of these executive roles, this is what one VC said. When I came back, I thought universities were in the dark ages, and I was pretty sure I was right. I had a different view on a number of things, not a radical, just a different view, but it was a very important thing to do in terms of getting some perspectives. We know that in research management in particular, that the predominance of research managers and the DVCs are from the hard sciences and the biosciences and management, not the social sciences or humanities. I'm just going to go through this. And when asked by asking a senior member of the Australian Research Council who does the funding, this is what was said. Unquestionably, the skills that come with scientific training help in this game. There's no question about that. I think it's the numeracy, the kind of analytical skills. It's the capacity to understand, get your head around difficult concepts. So I've been asked a lot in the last few weeks whether they think you need to be a scientist to do this job, that is being a DVC researcher. And I think it's, if you had someone from the humanities who had the kind of those analytical skills and that numeracy, it wouldn't be a problem. And if vice chancellors ask me, they say, they're having trouble in recruiting a DVC. I would say, what's your Dean of Science like? That would be my advice. I say, just try up there, because usually that's the kind of person. Rude. Says a lot about the rest of us, doesn't it? I said, oh, thanks a lot. I'll not even think about that job anymore. Okay, so leadership habitus. So what is this saying? Vice-Chancellors looking at the dispositions that they are looking for in these executive leaders. One said being positive, a glass half full, not half empty, because that's meaning being too critical, obviously. Someone who can throw themselves ahead with any luck to take others with them. It doesn't matter if you can't, mind you, just lucky if you can. Being a dean is like a feudal lord, and the DVC is like being a member of the royal court. You have a lot of influence, but you don't have the armies. Their job is to produce policy and persuade those lower down to follow. Okay. In terms of recruiting executive leaders, they said, well, obviously, they have to have some, certainly if they're in the research or the teaching and learning positions, they have to have academic credibility. That is important because it is actually a senior academic management position. But they have to have commitment to the brand and to the strategic positioning. I'm not interested in anybody who isn't prepared to be part of that vision and isn't prepared to play that role. And I tell you, that message goes down through the whole university, through the professoriate, and everybody told us in that university that if you don't like it, you get out. And they did. Non-academics, you have to be very careful that they can adjust to the culture and keep the culture. And for the research leaders, it's all about how to make certain you really understand the global. Now, what was emerging when we were looking at this data was that there was a very clear distinction between the DVC research engagement, all the rest, who are outward-looking, global-looking, and the internal type of domestic labour that is undertaken by those in charge of teaching and learning. So here you've got the DVC research, talking about the whole context, globally understand what's happening. It's not just research. It's about the economics, demographics, society, technologies. And then you look at what the females say about their job in teaching and learning. It's all about quality of teaching and learning, delivering the certificates, responsibility of evaluation, accreditation, professional development, the other DVC academic, quality of teaching, improve the quality, curriculum, policies, position papers, etc. Much more an influence role, actually. It's about winning hearts and minds. So there's this very much clear division of labour between the women who are doing, mainly the women who are doing teaching and learning, and the men who are doing the globally oriented perspective. The women who are doing the change management, emotional labour, and they had, as PVCs and deans, shown the ability to persuade and convince, which were very important qualities, but they undertook the difficult organisational restructure. In other words, they're tidying up the house, keeping the quality going, brushing out the corners. I think what's interesting, we're talking about all of the people in these jobs said they loved the job, except for one who burst into tears in the middle of it, the interview. But it's about asserting the brand, being ambitious, exciting challenges, about building from cottage industries into corporate education businesses, a nice turn of phrase. And I think one has to be aware very much about the seductive nature of possessing and asserting executive power. I'm just going to keep on going since I've got Sue on my case. Okay, so what I'm saying is that despite the increased presence of women in executive position, there continues at the executive level the old divide between domestic, internally oriented roles of change management, teaching and learning, and the public, externally oriented organisational roles, such as global engagement research. Nor does the executive represent the epistemological diversity that constitutes a vibrant university community due to the increasingly strong market-driven science and instrumentalist mindset. Furthermore, the conditions of academic work, executive work, presume a particular capacity for flexibility and mobility, a careless and carefree individual, discouraging many women from taking it up. And, when I asked that DVC about it, she said, well, there's no time for anything, it's 7:24, and I said, what happens if you have a family? She said, oh, well, you don't have a family, and she said, certainly women don't have a family. So the women in these jobs tended to be, to get into executive management, these women had as well as merit to be a single, divorced, a supportive partner or wife, or without caring responsibilities. So Your Ideal Mate is a good book, well, that's a relief. That's basically all they got. So in researching gender, I want to finish. Gender was not an issue, they said, in terms of absolute overt discrimination. It's no longer acceptable in universities to discriminate, to overtly say things. That's pretty clear. But it was still problematic in terms of the structural and institutional impediments, the demands, all the things I've talked about. And the notion that women make choices about opting out and not applying is that so it's an individual choice is not the case, as I would argue. It is the ways in which institutions work. It's the ways in which, whenever women think they're getting there, there's a restructuring, another space or something happening that repositions them. So these women were at the DVC and PVC level ambiguously located, as were those in when I did the study earlier, when they'd moved up into middle management, ambiguously located in those positions within the entrepreneurial university. The social relations of gender with regard to power remain problematic, even when women are seen to exert greater influence over decision-making. So while gender inequality is still persistent, the dominant inequality is still persistent, that should be, while a dominant perception of equality occurs at the same time. That's an interesting little typo on my part. So, just to finish, I think we need to rethink about how we talk about doing this. It's not enough to talk about women and leadership anymore. We have to look at the social relations of gender. We have to look at the more complex way of thinking around gender hierarchy, emphasising the agency of women. We need to make more explicit recognition of the geography of masculinities, emphasising the interplay among local, regional and global levels. We need to have a more specific treatment of embodiment in contexts of privilege and power. And we need to have a stronger emphasis on the dynamics of hegemonic masculinity, recognising the internal contradictions within even that notion of hegemonic masculinity in itself. And I'm going to whip. See? So I'm arguing at the scale of politics of education and capitalism that there's been a regendering of education as a global field. That as women reach the higher echelons of higher education, they undertake the institutional and emotional management, domestic change work, whereas men are moving off into the global arena. The education capitalism and capitalists are embodied in transnational masculinity, of white male Western policymakers, entrepreneurs, consultants and philanthropists, and that the notion of gradual progress towards gender equity is flawed because it takes more than just time, the assumption that just over time you get a concentration of women and we'll just move up there and we'll get into these executive positions. So I've just finished up with a nice little comment about education generally with Nussbaum, saying that very critical of if we think about profitability as the main way that education works, and I'm leaving that as a question mark. Death of the university. Thank you.
Nice change.
Pardon? Nice change for us?
Oh yeah, Roger.
Roger.
Yeah, I was intrigued by this concept of leaderism, and I was wondering if it's about role or performance. And the final couple of slides showed us performance coming in almost for the first time. It was like an extension of bureaucratic leadership, bureaucratic headship. Now, so is leaderism, and what's the relation within leaderism of role and performance? Because you suggested that for the males, performance is about dispositions and skills that just about, in most of your quotes, add up to crude bullying. Is the performance of female leaders in terms of performance of leadership, is that different? Is that a kind of antidote to, a softening of, or is it just on a completely different role?
Okay. I don't want it to come over as an essentialist reading. that women are all good and caring and sharing, and that men are all bullies, etc. I mean, I'm trying to read through in a much more complex way than that, and I haven't got the opportunity at this point to go through that in much more complexity. I think that the leaderism is both role and performance, I think. It's a focus on leaders as having to be the main drivers, and in particular at the executive levels, the main drivers of organisational change. But at the same time, it's also about how they perform that role. And certainly in the case of, I can give you equal cases of women bullying, doing that type of language as well. So I just used those. I was more interested here talking about the division of labour rather than actually what they saw their role was, rather than actually how they undertook that role. So I think you would find that that everybody uses a different range, a whole range of activities. I think that some of the so-called bullying quotes that we used there, that I used there, you would find that individual was actually, as a VC, unbelievably popular, and he used a whole range of leadership, showed a whole range of leadership capacities, but was very blunt also in particular ways. I don't know whether that's answered your question. I think leaderism is about both. It's about a focus on leaders as being able to solve the problem. And that they can exert whatever powers is necessary to do that.
So some will rely just on the role, and others on their performance of it.
I don't think you can separate the two, can you? I mean, I think they had positional power. They had positional power. Yes. I think probably. I think women have to earn positional power more. They don't get it just through the position, but I think they had all earned it through what they had performed already at lower down, okay? I think probably, is that the question? Is that was answering your question? In terms of using their positional powers as exerting that?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got time now.
No, I know, we'll have a chat after.
It would be really interesting for you to reflect on how you do it. To us, I mean. Yeah.
To you?
We've got one question.
Yes.
Thanks, Jill. That was so depressing.
No, I actually realised it was depressing after I'd finished, particularly finishing up with this. Sorry, Nick.
I'm kind of really interested, like you, I've seen many bullying women who occupy these spaces. And,
I don't want to make it.
I like to call them F2Ms, the sort of feminists to managers.
Yes.
Suddenly, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on what happens when women kind of cross over to the dark side and actually kind of enwrap themselves
in the leadership habitus.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a very interesting one. I mean, there's lots of debates about this, as you know. I mean, like, is it something about the individual woman that fits in more? I mean, I think I've often used the notion of homosociability. People are selected into the job because they fit in, people are comfortable with them, and so a lot of the selection processes that go on is about how they're going to fit in, and is everyone else going to be comfortable with them. I think also there's elements of it that there is an element of it that some women get into those jobs, and they, as I said, one burst into tears in the middle. She was just unbelievably overwhelmed with what she was expected to do in terms of how she was expected to do it. Didn't like it. I think those that get into it and seem to excel in it, which is the question you're asking, isn't it? Those that seem to take on a particular managerial habitus, they're interesting, and I just think they're showing the same array of human behaviours that men display. I think we have to be careful and make it a too strong a gender divide. What I was trying to argue here is that there's a whole set of conditions of labour that are happening that are encouraging certain types of behaviours and dispositions, and that those types of people are the ones that tend to get to the top. And that it's a whole set of structural and cultural conditions that emerge. I'm not trying to say that women are like this or all women are like this or all men are like that. I think we have to get into a much more complex understanding around the social relations of gender than falling into that simple essentialising divide. And I don't think I showed that enough in this, but I was really talking about the structural conditions that were setting up these people in particular ways. It hasn't come through to me as yet, because when you try to talk to, it's very hard to get them to say things as to how they change. We ask that question. How do you think you have changed when you have moved from these positions? And you don't get a lot. They're very closed at this level, very careful in what they say at people, when you interview people in these positions. You get very few who really are forthcoming. Careful in interviews. Except for that Vice-Chancellor, a couple of Vice-Chancellors who didn't seem to care.
Well, Kirsten Locke and I have been interviewing in Denmark for your study, and we found that too, the people in leadership positions that actually... Sorry. Kirsten Locke and I have been interviewing in Denmark for this project, and we found that one of our leader women that we interviewed ended the interview by saying, "No, you can quote me. I've been extremely careful what I've told you." So you get that. I want to thank you very much, Jill. I want also to make a connection between what Nick was saying yesterday and what you're saying today, because you focused very much on the kind of line management. And what seems to me is happening in the Australian universities you've described is that all the bits of the university are being brought into that line management structure.
Well, they are the core work now.
Right.
We are the marginal workers, academics. I always joke that.
No, but what I'm also thinking about in the Danish system is if you can get external funding for a big research centre, you can sit like a carbuncle on the edge of the hierarchical leadership system, and there are some women who are finding spaces there for creating alternative ways of managing.
Can I say that was my space?
Right.
Until now, and now the executive is starting to exert on me.
Right.
As I said, I'm going back to be done.
To be done, yeah. But the point I wanted to make was Nick's way of looking for spaces or spaces of hope for finding alternatives.
Yes.
And I think what we're trying to do in this ITN project is also create that kind of space across the universities. How successful we are is up to the fellows to decide, but we're trying to create alternative ways of thinking about how to lead and run and manage our work.
I was just going to say the reason that we're being we're being invited to be, they're going to help us, they said, is because we had a review of the centre and it was seen to be so successful due to my collaborative leadership. They've decided they're going to help me. So, the irony of life.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Jill, for getting us off to a good start.